Welcome back to Catastrophe Chronicles. I'm Katie Babbick, and here we explore disasters in excruciating detail so you don't have to.
And I'm Arin Babbick, and today we're talking about one of NASA's most infamous uh-oh moments. One so preventable, it's honestly painful to look back on.
That's right. We're diving into the Challenger disaster. But since NASA made so many bad decisions leading up to it, we're splitting this one into two parts. Today, we're covering the red flags, ignored warnings, and corporate nonsense that made this tragedy inevitable.
Spoiler alert, if you've ever been told to just do your job and stop asking questions, congratulations. You've got something in common with these engineers who tried to stop this launch.
Except in this place, the people ignoring them were literally gambling with human lives.
And doubling down like a bad poker player who refuses to fold.
So, before we even get to the explosion, we're breaking down the layers of arrogance, pressure, and outright neglect that got us to launch day.
Strap in, folks, because this episode is a slow-motion disaster, and NASA's about to learn that physics do not care about public relations or funding restraints.
Hey folks, welcome back. Another episode, another week. We're excited to be here and excited to have you here too.
Yes, we are.
We had a pretty mellow week. I hope everyone else did too.
It's been pretty good.
Yeah, living the dream.
You know, you got to preface that because nightmares are dreams too.
There's that. This was the good kind of dream. I don't know about white picket fence, but the good kind of dream. We got brigaded a bit by moon landing deniers, which was that was funny. I got a kick out of it. I let it go for a while because I don't know. I was just kind of laughing about it and didn't respond, and then ultimately blocked them. And for future reference, if you're listening, we believe in science. We don't believe in conspiracy theories. And that's just how it's going to be. And it's our platform. So if you want to spread conspiracy theories, that's fine. Go do it somewhere else. I'm not the federal government, so I can't infringe upon your First Amendment rights. But my podcast is not the place for nonsense. I mean, it's the place for nonsense, but not that kind of nonsense.
Damn right.
So here we are. We are on part 2 of what's looking like it's going to be at least a 4-part series of space disasters. I had an
ever-growing space series.
Well, I probably could have cut this one down further because I was thinking about it because there's parts of this that really tie into the Columbia because the reasoning for both the Challenger disaster and the Columbia disaster are basically the same. There's more to it than that, but they're basically the same. And so I thought about cutting out some of the stuff that kind of ties into the Columbia and putting that in that episode and da-da-da. And then, I decided I didn't want to do that. I want to do it kind of more chronologically, starting from the beginning of the space shuttle program all the way through Columbia, which is not quite the end of the space shuttle program, but that's where we're ending this.
I can see how that works.
Yeah, so this episode...
Linear flow.
Yeah, we're splitting Challenger into 2 different episodes. This week, we're going to be covering the lead-up of everything that kind of happened before the Challenger exploded. And we're going to be able to explore and talk about all the things that led to why the Challenger exploded. And then next week, we're going to talk about the actual disaster itself, which I keep saying explosion, but it wasn't actually an explosion, which we'll get to next week.
All right.
And then we'll also cover the Rogers Commission and the aftermath of the Challenger explosion. And then the following week, we will be doing Columbia. And then I have to decide if we're going to do one, like a special one on Russian disasters in space.
Ooh.
Because there's some interesting Soviet shit that happened during their whole portion of the space race. And I don't know. Let me know. If you guys want the Russian disasters, shoot me a message on one of our social medias or whatever.
All right.
And let us know, because if there's a real interest in it, I'll do it. If there's not, I may move on to something else. We'll see. It is. And as always, if you like the podcast, give us a like and review. We have a tip jar and all of our different things. We have social media. Get in contact with us. We like talking to you. We like hearing from you. So, yeah.
Unless you're spewing conspiratorial nonsense.
Unless you're spewing conspiratorial nonsense.
But, sometimes I do find some conspiracy theories fun, but some of them I don't.
I like the theory behind conspiracy theories sometimes, but like the Earth is round. Plate tectonics are real.
Oh, you're gonna make some people mad. Katie.
Man landed on the moon. Like these are just I don't know. I feel like there has to be some foundation of fact and truth. And those are my foundations of fact and truth. The Earth is in fact round. It circles the sun. People landed on the moon. These are real things, okay? And I don't know. Maybe we just part ways if you don't believe that. And that's okay with me. Sorry, not sorry.
All right. So where are we starting?
We're starting with Galaxy Lemonade.
Ooh.
We're drinking Galaxy Lemonade, which is a very, very difficult drink to make.
Yeah.
Yep. You first take lemonade, right?
Okay.
And then you take vodka and you put them together and you call it Galaxy Lemonade. And now you have a space-themed drink. Well, is that not amazing?
We have strawberry lemonade.
That's true. That's because that makes it more colorful, like a supernova, and definitely not because it's what my children prefer from Costco.
You work with what you have.
Yeah, I really worked hard on the drink this week. Like, really, really, really hard.
It is tasty, though.
I need to focus. We can focus, right?
Maybe.
We're focused people. This is actually the second
That's not
time.
how I describe myself.
The ADHD belies a really focused interior inside of you. What you're focused on makes no sense, but you are focused on it.
That there is the ridiculous hyperfocus that comes with.
You're almost always hyper-focused on something, which is both the problem and the solution, depending on how you look at it.
It's true.
So we actually recorded this last night, and then I was like, no, I don't like it. So now we're re-recording. So hopefully that means it'll be so much better for you guys. But we need to get going because I didn't get through all my notes when we tried it last night before I went, you know what, Arin? I'm not happy. And we were 2 hours into recording when I went, I'm not happy. So hopefully
maybe
we do well today.
Part down a little bit? Did you part down? Or...
Absolutely not.
Okay.
I reorganized the information so it flowed better, so I felt better about it. But no, absolutely not.
All right.
I don't know how to par down on like anything ever. I am all extra all the time. That's just how I live my life.
I love you.
So our quote for this week.
Lay it on me.
Let's face it. Space is a risky business. I always considered every launch a barely controlled explosion. By Aaron Cohen, NASA administrator, which is very fitting for this week's episode. Every launch has a real element of danger from the very beginning of the space program. And as we'll see through the course of this week and the next week.
You're basically strapped to a missile. So yeah.
You are very much. And like I said, we're going to get some more details about that. So we left off on our very first space episode. We talked about the Apollo missions. We talked about the Apollo 1 fire and what a difference the Apollo 1 fire made in the NASA hierarchy. It really changed a lot of the ways they did things because people died.
Yeah.
And they wanted to change it. It changed the way they related to the press. It changed the way that they dealt with like safety issues. And the Apollo 13 mission, I would argue, is really the pinnacle of NASA's triumph. There's an argument to be made that landing on the moon would be that.
Yeah.
But I think it was Apollo 13 because it took an incredible amount of ingenuity and understanding of safety and really making good choices and thinking through those choices. And after the Apollo missions ended, after Apollo 17, it seems like NASA kind of decided, you know what? Nah. Let's not do that anymore. Let's not live that way.
Oh, man.
At the end of the 1960s, so early 1970s, America really started getting bored with the entire space race. We landed on the moon. We're over it. We're done.
Been there, done that.
We're done. We're good. And this is partially because they had already seen the moon landing. Even by the time we were talking about Apollo 13, they weren't even airing those, missives from space.
Right, because they had landed on the moon a couple of times.
Yeah, people were already bored at that point. But it was that, and then also there's all these other problems going on at home. You've got Vietnam. The civil rights movement had just, ended, but really is still a thing because America
takes some time for change. And
there was a couple of different assassinations, Martin Luther King, Bobby Kennedy, just a lot of turmoil going on in the United States at that time. On top of that, America really kind of lost its innocence in regards to space during Apollo 15. On Apollo 15, a number of the astronauts smuggled hundreds of specially stamped envelopes to the moon so that they could bring them back and sell them to set up trust funds for their children.
Wow.
And up until that point, astronauts...
That's shiesty.
Isn't that shiesty? Up until that point, astronauts really were all just kind of like... they really were all white, upstanding, church-going men. And NASA really pushed this image of them. So it was shattered when the Apollo 15 astronauts took advantage.
I'll amend my statement. Not shiesty, but like greasy.
Yeah, it's gross. Like,
Yeah.
I don't know if it's necessarily like totally immoral, because I guess get your bag, but also it's icky. It feels icky.
It feels gross.
It feels shisty. It feels greasy. I like greasy. That's a good one. But they did that. And then right after the Apollo 15 scandal, it was found out that a number of the Apollo astronauts from those later missions were starting to charge for autographs.
Oh, wow.
So $5 a piece in the late 1960s, early 1970s. And the combination of those two things, really, they just shattered the myth. It makes you feel icky. And it shattered the myth of these perfect, upstanding astronauts. Because when you look back on Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin,
they were doing it for the science and the exploration, and that's what it seemed.
Yeah. And they shattered it. They broke it with those things. So America's
money.
They're over it.
Yeah.
On top of that, with the civil rights movement and all these other, movements going on in the country, people were really starting to question why basically every single scientist and every single astronaut was a handsome white man. Like, why are there not women? Do you guys think that women can't do this? Do you think minorities can't do this? What's going on? To be fair, in NASA's defense, which is a very minor defense, but it does exist, there were a number of Black women who worked for NASA in the 1960s. They were known as computers and skirts.
Oh, okay.
Because they literally did the math for all the different things going on. They were just brilliant at math, and they were behind the scenes, so the public didn't see them. Their story...
Oh, yeah, because we can't have that.
No, of course not. Their story, though, is memorialized in the book Hidden Figures, and it's also a film, which is really, really great. I read it with my kids a couple years ago. We thoroughly enjoyed it. Very, very good story. And even at the beginning of the space program, Kennedy did want to hire more Black people in particular, but minorities in general. He pushed for some of that to happen. In an internal memo, a letter that was sent to Administrator Webb in the 60s from one of Kennedy's folks in office. It read, "Dear Jim, why don't we put the first non-white man in space? If your boys were to enroll and train a qualified Negro and then fly him in whatever vehicle is available, we could retail our whole space effort to the whole non-white world, which is most of it. As ever, yours, Edward R. Murrow." Which, I mean, that's not really like, let's do this because it's a good thing to do and it's the right thing to do. But there was a push to not just have white men. It existed. And it's important to note that happened.
Reading old texts about the kind of stuff it's always...
Makes you feel icky.
Well, yeah.
Makes you feel real icky because it is icky. But it's not something a lot of people know. And it's definitely not something that people knew in the early 1970s.
Right.
In 1962, after a lot of that initial pushing, 27-year-old Captain Edward Joseph Dwight, who was a B-57 bomber pilot with a degree in aeronautical engineering, was hired by NASA. He was supposed to eventually become an astronaut. He did decently well in astronaut training, but he was definitely, there was a lot of racism, a lot of people trying to push him out of the program. He was not appreciated in general, so he ended up leaving and doing something else later. The first African-American who was actually elected to fully join the program was a man named Robert H. Lawrence, and that was in 1967. NASA, however, didn't choose him. The Air Force did. The Air Force was, at that point, giving NASA folks they said were qualified astronauts, and here, this guy is an astronaut. Unfortunately, he died 6 months after he moved over to NASA in a test pilot training exercise. So it's there. On top of, in addition to that stuff going on, after the moon missions, NASA also had a really difficult time planning for what comes next. They really didn't think about it in the beginning. There was a number of questions in the mid-1960s through the late 1960s from the administrations that were in office, which would be Johnson and Nixon.
Right.
But NASA kind of ignored those questions and was hyper-focused on getting to the moon and didn't have a lot of answers. So when they got to the moon, and in that in-between time where they have, they made it to the moon, but we're still doing Apollo missions, they started trying to figure out what they were going to do. And the plans were pretty nutty, especially considering the fact that in 1969, as soon as the moon was reached, NASA's funding was cut by a quarter, pretty much right after. They went from 377,000 people among the contractors down to 186,000 people.
Oh, damn, that's a big cut.
Right? And there's a number of these little space towns all over the country.
Space towns.
Well,
the
because
Jetsons.
When this whole thing kicked off, right, in the early 1960s with JFK's "let's go to the moon," Congress was lobbying to get their states contracts their state's workers contracts to build various parts of the space missions. So these contracts would go to whatever company in whatever town. That town would build a factory, and that factory would hire lots of workers, which meant lots of people moved there. And it's very much like coal towns without the,
it makes sense.
Company store.
Still think the Jetsons is cooler.
You do think the Jetsons are cooler. But by the early 1970s, pretty much as soon as the moon landing and the first moon landing stopped, these towns started to kind of die out because the funding was drying up. They weren't building as many things. So there's a lot of just not great stuff going on. At its peak, NASA itself had some 400,000 men and women at work on Apollo. And the program support facilities alone cost a total of $2.2 billion.
Holy crap.
So cutting that by a quarter, they cut around 100,000 workers just from NASA itself. It doesn't make a ton of sense why they had such ambitious plans unless you think of it from the standpoint that they were hoping that they would be able to get the funding approved for it. But even that was unlikely because the early 1970s saw the beginning of a pretty horrific recession in the United States.
Yeah.
But they were pretty intense. They were pretty, I think they sound pretty cool. I wish they had done more of these.
I mean, if you sell a good idea, if you make it fanciful and great, maybe you get fun if you get someone to buy off on it.
Yeah, I mean,
because they think it's cool.
You might as well try shoot for the moon. Shoot for the moon.
They already did that.
Right?
Shoot for
they did
Mars.
Which actually, now that you mention it, Vice President Agnew had a plan to land an American on Mars by 1986. He announced that plan. He tried to pull a Kennedy 2 months after the first moon landing in 1969. This did not catch on at all. Other plans included things like a Martian explorer ship that would depart the Earth in 1981 with nuclear rocket engines. Those nuclear rocket engines were actually in a pretty advanced state of research and development at that point. Yeah, they were looking into it and they were trying. That got cut, but they had some more going there. Another idea was a reusable spacecraft to shuttle astronauts up and down from a space station that was there.
That does sound familiar.
That does sound familiar. I mean, that does end up happening, but definitely not in the 70s. Another plan was building a permanent base on the moon, and that was in conjunction with the space station. So you would go easily up and down from the space station, and they go from there to the moon and live on the moon for a while.
These guys were part Bond villain.
They were very much part Bond villain. Unfortunately, the American public had very little interest in spending more money on this. After the Apollo 11 mission, which is where Neil Armstrong landed on the moon for the first time, there was a Gallup poll that showed 53% of Americans opposed a Mars landing by an American. And more than half of people wanted to spend less on the space program. So President Nixon was abundantly clear, you're not going to Mars. You're not getting a space station, and you're not getting a moon base.
No moon base.
So that left reusable space vehicle.
There you go.
Before the reusable space vehicle was made, they did have kind of an interim program called Skylab, where they built little mini unmanned space stations that they shot off in space. People did go up to them, but they weren't intended to be permanently manned the way the International Space Station is today.
All right, makes sense.
So the space shuttle program was actually the fourth program. One of the other things that happened in the interim time while they were trying to figure things out was called the Apollo-Suez program, which was the first crewed international space mission. The United States and the Soviet Union carried it out jointly in July of 1975, which is pretty cool. Millions of people around the world. Cool. Yeah. Millions of people around the world watched on television as an American Apollo spacecraft docked to the Soviet Suez spacecraft. Basically, a giant handshake in space.
Yeah.
Hoping to kind of we're not putting nukes up here. It's fine. We're not militarizing space. We're good.
Secretly, we brought nukes.
It's fine. In 1972, President Nixon approved starting development on that reusable spacecraft that we talked about, which would eventually become the Space Shuttle program. He did not approve the space station. So the Space Shuttle was going to just go into orbit and come back down. But it was, in theory, supposed to be reusable. I mean, it did become reusable. That happened. The idea was it would be able to save money because you could use it over and over and over again, unlike the other missions we'd had, which cost millions of dollars per ship that just sunk to the bottom of the ocean.
Or burned up on reentry.
Or whatever, yeah. A large reason why Nixon ended up approving this program at all is because he thought they could use the space shuttle to get rid of nuclear waste in space. bring up the spent rods and just throw them off in space. And this is around the same time that 3 Mile Island happened. So, like, there's good reasons for it.
That has no potential future consequences.
None.
Just
None
put
whatsoever.
your radioactive trash in space.
Just throw it up there. It's fine. The space shuttle itself was designed in large part, or at least the idea of it was figured out in large part by a man named Max Faget. Now, Max Faget was a freaking genius, but an incredibly eccentric character.
Okay.
He had a nickname that was based off of his last name. It was an acronym for his last name.
Okay.
Flat ass guess every time. Amazing. He continually confounded his detractors and people that just didn't like him and didn't like his crazy ass ideas, but almost always being correct with his ideas that were often like, he didn't write things like draw them on, the pristine graphing paper that most of NASA used. He would just grab whatever, like a cocktail napkin, and draw out whatever it was he wanted to design. Things like, the Mercury capsule. He was a large part of that. And everyone would look at it and go, that's insanity. That doesn't make any sense. And then it would fucking work because he was just genius.
It reminds me of another military acronym, or acronym that we use in the military. It's not an official.
It's not real. What is it?
PFM, pure fucking magic.
That's Max. That's Max right there. Pure fucking magic. One of the quotes by somebody who did actually like him was, "The United States could run for the next 100 years on the ideas Max had while he was shaving this morning." So, yeah.
Well, sounds like a cool guy.
Very, very interesting dude. The space shuttle design that he came up with looked like it was shit at first, but it wasn't because Max is amazing. Yeah. He came into work one day once this project was in its process of being approved with this cardboard design that he had made at home, like an art project. And it was essentially basically an aircraft with a very short and snubby fuselage, very short turned up wings, and a tailplane with 2 fins on it. So everyone kind of looked at it and was like, you can't just fly an airplane to space, even if it's short and fat. That's not how this works. And Max was like, no, fam, watch. And he threw it. And as it's gliding through the air, it goes up like it should, like a rocket ship should, into space. But as it started to come back down because of the design, instead of pointing its nose down, it came down horizontally, slowly but surely, meaning that the fat part of the underpart of this plane, of this space shuttle, was exposed to what would be the worst of those forces coming into the atmosphere, which means they would be able to put the heat shield there and keep it protected when it came back into the atmosphere.
You need that surface area for heat dissipation.
Exactly. And because of the wing design, they would be able to fly it like a regular plane. They could theoretically put airplane engines on it so that once it came into the atmosphere, it could fly just like a regular plane. And then it had engines on the back end so it could fly in space like a regular shuttle.
Oh, crazy.
Just a really fascinating design. And that's almost what we got with the space shuttle. If you can picture the space shuttle in your mind, the wings didn't have engines on them, but it is very similar to what we got in the space shuttle itself.
Yeah.
The official name of the space program was the Space Transportation System, or STS, which was taken from a 1969 plan for a system of reusable spacecraft. And it was the only item that was funded from that design and that project for development. It was originally proposed to be a nuclear shuttle, so powered by nuclear power, but that idea was given up eventually. Overall, after the space shuttle was finally made and everything happened, it flew a total of 135 missions and carried a total of 355 astronauts from 16 different countries, many of which on multiple trips.
That's pretty cool.
The space shuttle program did a lot, and while we're going to be talking about the bad parts of it, it is also just, fucking cool as shit. I say that knowing that the space shuttle program was essentially just space truck.
Space truck.
It's just a fucking Amazon truck going in and out of space repeatedly. That's what the program was designed for. They needed it to be cheap. They knew they weren't going to get anything big and expensive approved. And not only did it need to be cheap, bonus points if it can make money or, support itself in some way.
Yeah.
So the big idea behind it, on top of it being reusable and saving money that way, is they could use it to carry payloads into space. They could charge different companies for putting, their communication satellites up. They could charge the Pentagon for putting their spy satellites up.
I'm going to put my guns in space.
Put guns in space. And then the obvious research benefits were there as well. But really, it's a space truck. It's a space truck that has a fringe benefit of research abilities.
Space truck. That kills me.
When they presented this to Congress and to the administration, NASA presented it basically saying it would make money. You give us this much money now, and we're going to make you money in the future. And they trotted out a study that they conducted inside of NASA. And the study proved that this would make some money. It would be a very cheap alternative as long as the shuttle flew a total of 736 flights between 1978 and 1990. This comes out to be a little more than one flight a week.
Yeah, you're not going to get that kind of longevity out of it with all the forces that thing is going to be subject to.
Everyone bought it, though. And that is
so
what
essentially
their goal was.
they lied out their ass.
They lied out there. Well, I mean, it would have been a cheap alternative if they could do that. And they said, this is our goal. So is it a lie?
Obfuscation.
They're just being sneaky little shits. That's what's going on here. They think that there's a real aspect of ask forgiveness later instead of asking for permission. They figured if they sunk enough money into it, there'd be sunk cost fallacy and no one would actually rip the program away from them. This is kind of the beginning of our problems. This is the beginning of our problems. The technological challenges of building the space shuttle, however, dwarfed the challenges of building the one to go to the moon, the Apollo program, and the challenges of building the atomic bomb.
Because it had to be reusable.
It had to be reusable. It's a big deal. It's a lot of research, a lot of development if, you do it right.
If you put an F.
Foreboding music.
Dun,
However,
dun.
One of the books I read about it talked about, even though this was going to be a huge scientific project that required tons of work and tons of money, it was the equivalent of Magellan saying that his next big project was going to be rowing across a harbor after he circumnavigated the globe.
Yeah.
So it's not that interesting to the average person. It's not that compelling of a mission. The moon, man, the moon is exciting. Going to orbit and dropping off our trash, not as exciting. But
I'm hearing the backup beep from the garbage truck.
Right? Yep, basically. This was about the time that the three-letter agency NRO was sending up these absolutely insane spy satellites that could photograph things as small as 2 feet across with such fine definition that analysts could count people on a picnic blanket or how many missiles were on a military base. Now, these spy satellites were each the size of a Greyhound bus.
Oh, Jesus.
Containing 60 fucking miles of film inside of each one and weighing a total of 15 tons.
Wow.
The new shuttle would need to be able to take these into space because part of how NASA sold this program was we're going to be able to take the military stuff into space. So they need to be able to fit this in there. The Air Force also insisted that it needed to be able to glide at least 1,000 miles east or west to avoid being forced down in unfriendly territory. And it also needed the ability to be able to do around the Earth reconnaissance missions. So it needed to be able to spy on shit because that's what we do now.
Oh, that's just, small asks.
Right? No big deal. So the new shuttle would need to have an absolutely enormous cargo bay and the ability to lift 22 tons or more into polar orbit.
God.
These things were all pretty far from the capability of Sweet Max's design. So they took his idea and they kind of combined it with a man named Sanger, I'm going to butcher this name, Silbervogel, who was a rocket scientist who had originally worked for Hitler.
Yep, that checks.
Yep. I mean, there was 120 German rocket engineers that were brought over from Nazi Germany to join the space program. So he's just
We just stole their scientists.
We did. We really did. But he had designed something that he called the America Bomber.
Oh, that sounds quaint.
Yep. Quaint. No big deal. The America Bomber was very similar to the space shuttle. What it did is it flew up into basically almost orbit, just below orbit. And the idea was it would do just this giant parabolic arc from Germany to Japan. And it would go up in the air, it would bomb the east coast of the United States, and then it would land in Japan, refuel, get fixed up, turn around, fly back, bomb the west coast of the United States, and land in Germany before doing it again.
Wow. Hitler
wanted to use it. They weren't able to get it off the ground, thankfully. But Hitler wanted to use it to try and bomb the United States the way they were bombing the UK.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they were bombing everywhere, but very similar to the Blitz. So they took that design and they kind of combined it with Max's, and that's how we ended up with the space shuttle. This design didn't have things like air-breathing jet engines. Normally, airplane engines require oxygen to be able to function.
Yeah.
That's not something you can have. I mean, you can have it as long as you're not using it where there's no oxygen, but they got rid of those because it was going to add too much weight. They needed to be able to carry as much weight as possible into the atmosphere, so they took off as many things as they could. They also got rid of things like the rocket-powered escape system.
Oh, good. We're taking off safety features now.
Do you remember how we added that to
Yeah.
the Apollo? Do you remember what it was?
Are we
It's okay if you don't.
Are we talking about the Apollo 1?
Yeah, they didn't add those rocket-powered escape systems until after Apollo 1 because Apollo 1, it took so long to get the hatch off that they decided to add a rocket-powered, so blow off the top so people can get out. They got rid of that. Not going to have anything like that on anymore. Because of that change, because of getting rid of specifically the escape system and not designing a new one to replace it, Max Faget was over it. He was done. He literally quit NASA and went to work somewhere else because he wasn't willing to have his name ascribed to this project. He said on his way out that NASA had made a pact with the devil and he didn't want to be there anymore. Are you starting to see where we're going here? What we're doing with this?
The writing's on the wall.
The writing is on the wall. They also had originally under Max's plan, planned to use liquid rocket fuel, which is what all of the other space missions had used in the past. They decided we're not going to do that anymore. Instead, we're going to use solid rocket fuel. Solid rocket fuel had been determined by the Soviets to be too dangerous to use on manned missions.
Wait, if the Soviets say it's too dangerous, you're fucking insane if you try.
But that's what we did. We didn't just try. We did it for the space shuttle was launching from 1981 all the way through 2011.
They were the ones who the rest of the world said, high test peroxide fuel? No, it's too dangerous. And they were like, bet.
It's fine. But no, the Soviets would not use solid rocket fuel, but NASA decided we're going to use that. And again, it was almost entirely down to budget cuts. Liquid rocket fuel was significantly more expensive, and the booster rockets that it was used in were far more likely to be damaged when they crashed down into the ocean, making it more difficult to design ones that could be reusable.
Okay.
More expensive to design ones that could be reusable.
Expensive.
Yep.
Putting a price on safety. Yay!
That's what this literally, the next hour, however long I'm going to talk, is going to be about, is compromising safety for money. Liquid rocket fuel in rocket boosters could do things like be throttled up, turned off, turned back on. It could be changed to be able to adjust what was going on. Solid rocket fuel can't do that. It's essentially just strapping two giant fireworks onto the side of the three main engines that launch everything up into space and lighting them, and they go until they go. The entire 122 seconds that they're burning, they are on, they are going. You cannot turn them off regardless of what's happening.
Sweet.
Which is why they're so dangerous. If anything goes wrong, there's nothing you can do about it.
Yep, you're on the ride.
And you really can't do anything about it because you have no escape system.
Right.
So it's fine. We're good. We're fine. It's not like many veteran engineers that worked on the Apollo program were deeply opposed to this as well and considered it too dangerous and ultimately left NASA because they weren't willing to write their names onto a project that involved solid rocket.
All your veteran, smartest people are leaving.
Brain drain is not a problem for NASA. It's fun. 1972. This is the design that they presented. This is the design that they're going to make. NASA was awarded 4 contracts for each of the main elements of the space transportation system. The contract for the orbiter went to the same company who built the Apollo ships. And then the contract for the solid rocket boosters went to a company called Morton. Vehicle. Clearly, I'm the one who cooks in this house. Morton is the table salt. It's the same company that makes the table salt.
Okay. So, yeah, they're a logical choice to make a rocket.
Completely reasonable. It's fine. With the program now underway and them starting to make these ships, they also started going out and looking for astronauts to crew these ships. This was going to be the largest intake of astronauts in NASA's history. The plan was for them to build, originally the plan was for them to build 12 space shuttles, but it got whittled down to 4 with budget cuts.
Big drop.
Big cut. But even so, with 4 shuttles that they had said and promised that they were going to be able to launch,
Once a week.
More than once a week.
Oh.
They needed a significant number of astronauts. This was the first time that NASA actively sought out women and minorities to join the astronaut corps because they were instructed to make the astronaut corps reflect the diversity of the country that it existed in.
Okay.
Which, when I started doing research for this episode, I didn't realize there would be the DEI stuff going on in the world. So that's where we are. NASA was doing this. They were specifically looking for women and minorities to fill up their corps, which I think is a great thing. In 1972, the Equal Employment Opportunity Act had made it illegal for employers to discriminate based on race or gender. And NASA ended up hiring a Black woman to run its Equal Opportunity Program. And in 1975, Gerald Ford signed legislation that said all U.S. military academies had to admit female trainees, which meant now the military academies actually have some women inside of them because they're not being blocked out. And NASA really was required to try and hire people that didn't necessarily look like the white upstanding churchmen that their previous programs did. They wanted to hire 20 pilots and 20 mission specialists, a total of 40. They ended up hiring 35, but the goal was 40.
Okay.
The mission specialists had significantly lower standards for what it took to be able to get into that program because they were not the astronauts. They did not have to be, they were the astronauts. They weren't the pilots. They didn't have to be able to fly a plane, though, because that wasn't their job. Their job was to do things like science in space, to work the giant arm off of the space shuttle. So engineers, scientists, doctors, things like that. People who could learn things by being in space. So they don't need to be quite as physically fit as former astronauts did. Not everyone at NASA was psyched about this. Deke Slayton, who you might remember from our last episode, he's the one who tried to crawl into the Apollo 1 to work out the comms and wasn't allowed to. He quit because he was so against the idea of really trying to integrate the astronaut corps. So kind of a bummer.
Kind of shitty.
Just on a fun side note, Russia actually had ladies in space long before NASA. In 1963, on June 16th, 1963, Valentina Tereshkova was a Soviet cosmonaut and the first woman to travel in space. She ended up going up in a Vostok 6 and completed 48 orbits of Earth in 71 hours.
Damn.
Pretty neat. Yeah.
That's really cool.
Yeah.
I mean, I will say this in terms of integrating women into a lot of these places within NASA and within the military, we're usually behind other countries. Most of the countries had women in subs, submarines, years and years ago, and it was only like 6 or 7 years ago, maybe, that we started trialing.
Oh, American women just aren't as good at it. Oh, I'm going to get in trouble for that. Anyways.
Wow.
Wow. Just kidding. I didn't mean that. That was sarcasm for anyone out there.
There's just going to be one little clip.
So the new class of astronauts came out in 1978. There was a class of 35, and it had 6 women in it.
Okay.
Pretty darn cool, including Sally Ride, who you might recognize as the first American woman in space, and Judy Resnick, who flew on the Challenger.
Okay.
This class called themselves TFNG.
The fucking new guys.
Well, on paper, 35 new guys.
Oh, yes.
But they were pretty explicit, and they're still pretty explicit, that they absolutely took that acronym from the military acronym of FNG, fucking new guy, and made it their own. So 35 new guys. Wink, wink. One of the first things this class of astronauts had to do was go and tour Cape Canaveral, and while they were there, they had to listen to the audio of White, Grissom, and Chaff when they died on the launch pad in Apollo 1.
Oh, God.
Something that all new astronauts that joined the program after Apollo 1 had to do, because it was really important to NASA administrators to impart upon the astronauts that this was not like flying a commercial airliner. This was not necessarily a safe thing. They did their best to make it safe, but on its face, this is brand new technology. No matter how much you test it, it's not always safe, and you need to have an understanding of it. You need to have an understanding of how important it was to do your best and to try not to make mistakes, because mistakes were incredibly costly. It could cost you your life if you were not careful.
Yep.
The first voyage for the space shuttle was set to take place in 1979. But of course, this is government work with budget cuts, and on a shoestring budget at that. So things were going significantly slower than intended and significantly over budget. The budget
par for the course.
Par for the course. The budget cuts to the program were a huge problem and a huge contributor to why they weren't able to make their initial launch date. Like I said before, there was initially enough budget to build 12. By the time 1978 rolled around, there's only enough for 5. And even then, never mind, let's make it 4. And with those 4, do we really need rigorous quality control?
No.
Is that really necessary? NASA thought not.
You motherfuckers.
The agency was forced. You're welcome. You're going to get so mad.
Mm-hmm.
You're welcome. The agency was forced to push back deadlines due to that shrinking yearly budget. And then they also had to pull from their scientific research and development and unmanned program to be able to keep that shuttle program going. And NASA admin and the real high execs at NASA considered the shuttle program to be necessary for the agency's survival. They did not think the agency would continue forward if they didn't have something big, splashy, and fancy. And apparently, a space Amazon truck was the best that they could handle. That's where we are. The overrun of budget was so intense that Carter almost nixed the space shuttle program entirely. The only reason he didn't is because the Pentagon lobbied him not to, which means they're on a shoestring budget and they're even more beholden to the military.
Oh.
And y'all know how Arin feels about military grade tech.
Oh.
And how strongly and how much he loves all of that stuff going on.
No, it means it's crap.
Well, now it's military grade. The NASA program is dependent on being military grade. So it's fine, right?
Look, I mean, there's different. There's some things because they have to be in the military that are of higher quality. But this whole so flustered, so upset, I can't even put my words together on this. So many different
I wish
thoughts
you could see
streaming
his face
through my brain right now. Just the lack of quality control,
He had his angry hood on, and now he has his angry hands on his head as he hangs it in shame. So Morton,
oh my God,
vehicle. I'm going to keep going. I'm just going to talk over you, and you're just going to be mad, and everyone can listen to Arin moaning in the background. Morton, vehicle. They're in charge of the solid rocket boosters. This company had a very mom and pop attitude, and quality assurance and engineering changes, all these kinds of things were very informal, which is exactly what you want in a manned rocket ship going into space. It was an imperative not to invent or need to test anything new and to make existing rocket technology work for this new thing instead of trying to figure something out. It was... The rockets were so incapable of doing pretty much anything but be on fire and shoot off really hard that there was not even telemetry in the cockpit for the astronauts to see what was going on with the rockets because there's nothing they could do about it anyway. So might as well not look at it. This is reasonable. It's fine, right?
I mean...
The readings did go down to Houston, so Houston could see. But the astronauts had no idea what was going on. This was by design. Any attempt to jettison them before the fuel was consumed at 122 seconds after launch would burn up the entire spacecraft. So even if they tried to eject them, I mean, I guess it wouldn't always, but there is a strong potential if they ejected them too early. The shot of flame coming out the bottom would just incinerate everything in its path. So we're just going to ride them up on a hope and a dream, guys. Even with that already sounds bad enough. There were other problems.
Go figure.
From the very, very beginning. For example, the engines. Now, on a rocket ship, if you picture the space shuttle is essentially made up of 4 parts. You've got the orbiter, which is the plane portion of it, and that's connected to the main engine tank, which has 3 engines, and that's the big silo that's right in the middle. Either side of the silo are the rocket boosters. So we're talking about the engines, the big silo. There's 3 engines in the big silo. These engines are powered by a hydrogen and oxygen combo, so not flammable at all.
Yeah, highly
the worst kind of flammable.
Volatile and flammable.
This was a big part of how they got into space, and it had to get into space very precisely, survive the launch, survive re-entry, start and stop with 100% reliability, and burn continuously for 8.5 minutes. And then, after crash landing into the Atlantic Ocean, be able to do it again within a few days. NASA wanted each of these engines good for at least 100 missions. They also wanted the engines to be small because that big silo had to hold a shit ton of gas in it. So the engines at the bottom had to be pretty small and not weigh a ton. Those silos had to carry 390,000 gallons each.
Yeah, it's a lot.
Of liquid hydrogen and 145,000 gallons of supercooled liquid oxygen, held at nearly absolute zero. This giant silo tank was the largest of the tanks, and it was attached to the orbiter and the solid rockets by bolts that parted by explosive charges on the way into orbit. Any stray spark that went wrong would blow everything up. Each of these engines on that silo had a turbo pump that was designed to force the two liquids together in the rocket at 6,000 degrees Fahrenheit. And these pumps were
That's
so
a big
powerful.
change in temperature.
Big change. But I mean, as soon as you lit them, because these are so flammable, it went from almost zero to straight. And if you had them like warm at all, the chance of them blowing up was high. So it makes sense. The science is there. Obviously, the science is there, right? It worked. These pumps were so powerful that they could drain an entire backyard swimming pool in under 20 seconds. But they were no larger than a kitchen trash can.
What?
That's just the pumps, not the whole engine.
I can't imagine how they move that volume of water
Banana
that fast.
Pants. That's what it is.
Crazy.
Absolute banana pants. However, to save money, the company had decided to conduct all of its testing as up testing instead of testing individual components first and then testing it all together. What that means is they tested the components on a small scale and then just did math to make sure that the mathed all the way up to full scale.
No.
Instead of testing pieces one at a time and then putting them all together and testing them that way. That's what we didn't do. The reason why they did this is if they had tried to do it individually, it would have resulted in multiple explosions after tests failed.
Exactly.
But each failed test would cost them $40 million. And that's too much money. That's fine.
It might just cost someone's life.
Another big problem was heat tiles. If you know, you know. This is coming up in a few weeks. Heat tiles were a problem from the very beginning. We're going to go into this a lot more during the Columbia episode, but I just want everyone to know that this was a known problem from the very beginning of design and execution of the space shuttle. The frame of the space shuttle could not withstand the heat of reentry. Basically, not many things can. Heat of reentry is a lot. The area of the shuttle expected to face the most extreme temperature would be the nose cone and the leading edge of wings, and those were covered in panels of reinforced carbon-carbon. But most of the underside of the space shuttle was going to be covered in these little heat tiles. They were silica fiber tiles. They were made from sand and glued, like glass sand, glued to the surface of the spacecraft. They had the consistency of styrofoam on the inside, and then the outside was more like ceramic. So they were very lightweight and extremely fragile. They were made up of about 90% air. And when I say extremely fragile, I mean if you hit them with your keys a little too hard, they would break.
This sounds perfect for a re-entry vehicle that needs to do it many, many times.
This sounds completely reasonable for shooting into space. Like, none of them are going to fall off. It's fine. No big deal. With the complex curves of the spacecraft, Lockheed had to produce 34,000 of these tiles, and each one of them had its own individual place on the spacecraft, almost like a puzzle.
Oh, wow.
So the underside of it before the tiles were on was drawn out like a puzzle, and they had to match each piece to its place because you couldn't just line them up like normal. They all had their own individual spot. Completely
normal. It's the worst game of bingo ever.
Another problem that was known from literally the very beginning was something called the O-ring.
Okay.
Now, if you know from the beginning. The O-ring was part of the design for how the solid rocket boosters were connected together. The solid rocket boosters were built in parts, and then the parts were shipped to Cape Canaveral, where they were then put together. Okay. So you had the top with the nose cone, which connected to the next part down, to the next part down, to the next part down. Right?
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Those connections were made to be, they connected in a tongue and clevis joint.
Okay.
And then there was an O-ring that went inside those joints to make it airtight.
Seal. Yeah.
Basically the same thing you see in your car engine, the same thing you see in your sink. It's just a rubber gasket that goes in between those joints to keep them airtight. There was 2 on each tongue and clevis joint, so every rocket had 8 O-rings inside of it. So a total of 16 O-rings for each space shuttle. The O-rings, when you think of O-rings, usually you think of like small little rubber bands. These were 37 feet in circumference.
Jesus.
They were enormous, but only a quarter of an inch thick.
Oh, like the width of your finger.
That's the width of your finger, yep. If gas leaked through those joints, it could eat away the half-inch steel casing of the rocket like a blowtorch and completely wrench it apart in flight.
Good.
It could also eat through the paneling into that main engine area that had the liquid hydrogen and oxygen in it and light it on fire.
Wow.
Very, very important piece of the system. There was 2 O-rings because redundancy, and then all of these O-rings were coated in this flame-retardant asbestos-filled silly putty that they circled around the joint to make it even more airtight, kind of like what you use in the kitchen sink. Only, again, this is huge, enormous insanity. The fit was not necessarily great. From the very beginning, they realized that while in your car engine and on your sink, there is a little bit of flex, there is a little bit of give. In a giant rocket ship where you have 1,000 pounds of pressure, it flexes a whole lot more. So from the very beginning, they knew that those joints would open very briefly. And then as the pressure stabilized, would close again. And that's when they would seal. So from the beginning, they knew that there was this open and close. They knew from the beginning that they had a problem with blowouts in the silly putty that was around it, where little air pockets would form and air would blow out of it, and they'd have to tamp them down. So this was the thing.
And we just kept going. No problem.
Now, I want you to remember that.
Was this brought up with Oh,
yeah. We're going to get to that.
Okay.
We're going to get to that. Now, I said before they weren't allowed to design anything new. So they claimed this was not a new design, but it was. In all shapes and forms, this was a new design. But they said it wasn't because, O-rings have been used before in other situations, so it's not actually new. So it's fine. They did do horizontal testing on the solid rocket boosters that, are shot off from vertical.
Oh, yeah. It's completely the same thing.
Completely fine. It reminds me a lot of our station fire episode where we talked about how they tested the foam horizontally instead. So same idea. They tested it horizontally. It went reasonably okay, besides what I talked about there with the joint would open slightly for a second and then close again in the air holes that were opening. They claimed that it was just because that open and shut was just because they had tested it beyond the endurance it was intended to handle, and it wasn't going to have to do that when it launched the rocket ship.
How did they figure that?
They just said it. There's a lot of they just said it.
Just make shit up.
Nope.
To make sure that we can do our thing.
On a really just random side note, because I just remembered it, the O-rings were shipped in sections. They were shipped in 12-foot sections. And the reason I bring it up is because there was a group of polyamorous women from fundamentalist Mormon sect who were in charge of putting them together in the actual O-ring section, which I just thought was fascinating.
Why? What? Why?
Apparently they were the only people patient enough to actually put it back together.
How do you find that out?
I don't know.
How do you find?
It was something I read, and I was just like, of all the things I expected to read about for an episode about space, fundamentalist Mormon sect of polyamorous women splicing together pieces of a rocket ship that took our best and brightest into space was not on my bingo card.
No.
Of expectations.
Did not expect that.
There was, to answer a question you had earlier, a pair of memos written in 1978 and 1979 stating that the joint had been badly designed and needed to be modified.
Was there any feedback to that?
One received no response at all. The other one got it's fine. Neither one of them reached executives at NASA or executives at Morton Thiokol. These memos called for the problem to be addressed urgently, saying that the issue required attention to, quote, prevent hot gas leaks resulting in catastrophic failure. Here we are. It's 1979.
What middle management fuck did that shit? God.
There's a number of them. I'm so sorry, but not really. So 1979, NASA decided that they really needed some good press. They weren't getting a lot of good press. They needed to do something to capture the public's attention. It's been 10 years since the moon landing, and people have almost kind of forgotten that NASA exists. And also, do you remember I mentioned Skylab?
Yeah.
Skylab was about to crash out of space because NASA made some mistakes in its calculations. And they had also planned, its orbit was decaying, and they had planned on using the space shuttle, the first one, Columbia, to kind of nudge it back into orbit. But because of their bad calculations...
That won't go wrong at all. Let's take these budget cut spacecrafts and just slam them together in space.
It's fine.
It'll be all right.
Well, it didn't happen.
And put a bumper on it.
They didn't do the math right, and it was now going to crash onto Earth. And because NASA didn't have a full understanding of what was happening, they couldn't even say where it was going to crash land. So people were making fun of NASA a lot. So NASA was like, okay, we almost have Columbia built. We're going to ship Columbia. The keyword is almost have Columbia built. We're going to ship Columbia to Cape Canaveral and make a whole thing of it. Show it off, show people what we're doing. People are going to get real excited. It's going to be great. The ship looked reasonably okay before it took off.
Okay.
But what you couldn't see is on the inside, there was nothing important, engines installed yet.
Okay, so it's just a shell.
It's just a shell. Over 7,000 of those little tiles we had talked about hadn't been put on yet. So engineers went ahead and used double-sided tape to put styrofoam in their place to make it look good.
And wait, how did they ship it?
So they shipped it on the back of a military jet. So they just kind of loaded it on, it piggybacked on a military jet.
I've seen videos of that.
Yeah, it's pretty cool the way it does. This, however, was...
But yeah, you have
not super great.
Things just taped to it.
And then you fly it. And then you fly it.
That's not going to work.
And what you expected to happen, happened. Thousands of the tiles fell off. So when it arrived to Cape Canaveral, it kind of looked like a toddler did a bad haircut on himself with the tiles half shaved off. Of the 31,000
Inspiring
tiles...
confidence here, NASA.
Yeah, of the 31,000 tiles that had been installed on it, less than 2/3 of them were securely in place by the time it landed.
Goody!
Now, we're going to get into this a lot more in the Columbia episode, but this was called the Great Tile Caper. They realized once it landed that the way they had been attaching them to the ship actually made them more dangerous and more likely to get fucked up, so they had to redesign them. Oh. And on top of that, so many of them fell off. They had to reattach them, and they did a bunch of work here, this and the other thing, and they figured out that the best way to do this was to paint the backside of the tiles with this particular glue thing and have this whatever. Long story short, though, they had to individually hand paint every single one of those thousands of tiles and then attach them with vices to get them to stick to the aircraft. Each tile could take upwards of 2 weeks to be able to attach.
What kind of fucking adhesive is it? 2 weeks.
2 weeks.
How do they ever
and everything?
How do they ever complete that? 2 weeks per tile.
Lots and lots of people, because you can do more than one tile at once.
Well, sure.
But it took a long time. I mean, This is 1979. Columbia didn't launch until 1981.
There's a reason why.
It was supposed to launch in 1978. This was the point that they finally had to admit to Congress in November of 1979 that they were significantly behind schedule.
No shit.
If they were lucky, they would launch in 1980.
Wow.
The training for those astronauts, the TFNGs, our besties, was supposed to last 2 years. But after a year, in 1979, they cut training short because there was too much to do, and they put the astronauts on duty to finish putting Columbia together.
Oh, yeah. Let's just not fully train the astronauts who are going to fly this death trap.
Completely fine.
Oh, I'm sorry. They're not going to fly it. They're just going to ride it. That's all.
Basically.
Why do they have a fucking pilot?
This spectacle of the Columbia being flown into Cape Canaveral, which was intended to be an absolute press win, ended up feeling less like the glory of Apollo and more like the Three Stooges, which is not what NASA was going for. The press had already been all over NASA and just unhappy with them, and this only made it worse. The New York Times said, quote, "It would be courageous to accept the fact that pushing the limits of technology with minimal funding has become too costly and risky to complete as planned."
Damn.
The Washington Monthly had a much more amusing title to their article, in my opinion. They wrote an article and they titled it, "Beam us out of this death trap, Scotty."
She cannot do it, Captain. She cannot take no more.
It'll be fine. It'll be fine. NASA had a reputation for safety. And one of the reasons why they had this reputation for safety, even with all this other crap going on, is they still had what was called the Flight Readiness Review.
Okay.
Now, the Flight Readiness Review, I just want to bring it up now before we start going through all of the missions, was something that happened before every single launch. It was an analysis on how likely anything was to go wrong and whether or not that risk could be deemed acceptable. There was always going to be risk. But was that risk an acceptable level of risk? It was intended to be a forum to discuss problems and deal with things in a way that didn't put pressure on people. From the early Apollo days, the early Mercury, the early Gemini days, the entire basis of the flight readiness review was that if you didn't know, you erred on the side of don't launch. If you weren't sure, you don't do it. Be sure. Prove that it's safe.
Yeah.
At this time, the new administrator was a man named Administrator Beggs, and he was in charge of
like
ultimate decision.
Begs for money?
As in begs for money. He's an interesting character, but when it came to these flight readiness reviews, he was absolutely just a stickler for detail and pretty much micromanaged everything.
Yeah.
Like, are you sure this is good? Are you sure this is fine? If any problem got brought across his desk, he would chase it down until it was solved.
That's good.
So this is a good thing. We like Beggs overall. It's important to note that the only way Beggs can do that is if problems do make it to his desk. So things like the 1978 and 1979 memos about the O-rings never did make it to his desk.
Right, because when you're dealing with budget cuts and people potentially losing their jobs, living in this environment of fear.
Exactly. And that's
now you have this culture, kind of like the Russian military, what would happen to our military for a little bit, of you don't bring problems to your boss because you don't want to look bad, like you can't do it, because then you get chastised for it.
Exactly right. Exactly. And so much of NASA management had to concern itself.
People.
Yeah. And so much of NASA management had to concern itself with budget along with those thoughts of safety and everything. And like you said, they had to worry about their jobs. Those lower end lab rats and engineers, on the other hand, didn't. So a lot of times those lower people would bring issues to the middle management, who would not bring it up further because the middle management were the ones that had to worry most about losing their jobs or having issues because of budgetary things going on. Tensions between the two were hot at the best of times. The lower level engineers and lab folks, especially from the Science and Engineering Directorate, were the ones who wrote the initial memos in the 70s about the O-rings, and they very much considered it their sacred duty to root out any problems and bring them to light. And they were absolutely hated by middle management, and they absolutely hated middle management, and many of their things did not make it past that mid-level going on there. It's looking real safe, right? So the Columbia
of words
was supposed to launch in 1980, after it was supposed to launch in 1979, after it was supposed to launch in 1978. Now it's going to launch in 1981.
It's also par for the course.
This was going to be the very first time that NASA flew a manned flight as the first test flight of a ship.
What? Wait.
They were not going to test the ship without people on it. They were going to put people on it and make sure it works. And I'm going to remind you, they tested almost nothing at scale.
You're
Yep.
No tests. Got it.
I mean, there were tests, but definitely nowhere near. When you talk about or you think about the Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo astronauts, they were 100% courageous. Heroes. Amazing.
Absolutely.
Not the Apollo 15 guys. Fuck those guys. But most of them were amazing. They're the ones who snuck the stuff into space to sell it. Most of them were courageous. They were heroes, right? But every single one of them knew that their vehicle had been tested repeatedly before a human being was ever put inside of it. The TFNGs would not have that privilege or that comfort. John Young and Bob Crippen were the astronauts chosen to fly the Columbia for the very first time, and they would find out for themselves whether or not Columbia was truly fit to fly on its maiden voyage.
I cannot imagine being in that seat and knowing full well that this hasn't gone through the rigors.
They had, done simulations and things. And they had...
Oh, yeah, because I totally trust simulations, because you can model all of the variables that could possibly come up.
Every single one. But I'm speaking more specifically to they had procedures for if there was issues. And they had done simulations on if there were issues. Not that matters much.
Because they can't stop.
One of the engineers, though, that worked on those procedures, talking about plans for if things went wrong, said, here's the plan. Suppose one of these solid rocket boosters fail. The plan is die.
Comforting.
And many of the astronauts in the program considered the procedures that they had as essentially just a list of things for them to do before they died.
To keep them busy.
Just keep them busy. It's fine. Not everyone was just going, oh, well, if they die, they die. There were some people that were trying to make changes. The brain drain hadn't completely infected all of NASA yet. In 1981, before Columbia's first launch, managers from both Marshall Space Flight Center, who was in charge of the contractors, and Morton Thiokol presented their findings of those horizontal tests of the solid rocket boosters to a NASA certification committee, expressing concern about those leaking O-rings. So we now have the 1978-1979 memos, and now we have 1981, before any ship has launched, 3 separate definitive instances where there's concern being brought up about these O-rings. The NASA committee recommended that they run a program of further tests, including a full-scale static firing of the rockets at a range of temperatures covering the expected seasonal changes of weather at the Cape to confirm that they would always be safe. Morton and Thiokol managers assured the committee that it was fine if it was assembled carefully. It would all be cool. So the lower guys brought it up to the certification committee. Middle managers said, you know what? It's cool. Don't worry about it. So the O-rings were certified without those extra tests that the NASA committee recommended for the O-rings, and they were designated as fail-safe, meaning there was no chance of them failing at all. And that's what made it to Administrator Begg's desk, was that the O-rings were fail-safe. There was no way anything could happen to them.
Right. And there's no chance that the contractor who's building these things might lie out their fucking ass so they don't have to pay more money to make sure they work.
Yeah, totally fine. No big deal. Don't worry about it. On top of that, another thing that came up in those last, months leading up to the Columbia's first launch was, once again, the escape system. The
non-existent escape system?
Exactly. A number of engineers and astronauts harbored quite a bit of fears that the spacecraft was not reliable and that they needed to have a crew escape system. There was originally 2 ejection seats on the ship as it stood at that moment, but the plan was to have crews of up to 8 people. So, number one, ejection seats are not necessarily the best plan to have on a spaceship. Number 2...
Right. I don't know how that
I mean, how do you decide which 2 people in a crew of 8 get to use the ejection seats? Is it just the pilot and the co-pilot? Like, we leave 6 people behind? This is just not a great plan.
Right.
There was a number of senior NASA staff that continued to argue the ships needed to be redesigned to include an escape-like system very similar to what the Apollo program had after Apollo 1, but all of those efforts floundered completely thanks to costs and pure bureaucracy. Even the study on whether or not this was a good idea was shelved. Some of the higher NASA managers...
They just stopped the study.
They did the study, showed that it would be a good thing to do, and then they put the study up and didn't release it to Congress or the press or anything like that because they feared that if the public found out that it was a good idea to have an escape system, they would realize how dangerous the space shuttle was and they would lose approval. And they didn't have any approval to lose at this point. So this is the state of where we are.
Worth the lives.
This is the state of where we are on the first shuttle launch in 1981. On April 12th, 1981, exactly 20 years after the first crewed space flight, the orbiter Columbia lifted off from Pad A at Launch Complex 39 at the Kennedy Space Center at 12 o'clock UTC. And thankfully, it went extremely well, returning Americans to space for the first time in 6 years, and after 12 years of design, redesign, and creation for the very first space shuttle. It was the first time that a new craft's first flight was manned. I don't know if you've ever seen it, but this was the shuttle trip where Bob Crippen said, what a way to come to California when he landed the ship down in California as he was coming in.
I think I have seen
cool
the footage of it.
Yeah, this is that mission going on there. John Young and Bob Crippen were instant celebrities, and the success further boldened NASA. It was akin to the moon landing. There were millions of people watching it on TV when it landed in California. People were real excited to see this going on.
I mean, it looks really cool.
Yeah. Time magazine wrote, the shuttle had become a kind of technological Rocky, the bum who perseveres in the end, the underdog who finally wins. Which is, I like that. Even though it went well, this wasn't without its problems. Now, the way we talked about the flight readiness review. After a shuttle flight, though, they had to go and get everything out of the ocean.
Yeah.
They had to go refurbish it and all of that. Before they refurbished it, though, they did a post-flight inspection. So they would take everything apart entirely, look at all of it to make sure that nothing went catastrophically wrong, that nothing was a big problem, and then they would put it all back together again. And if there was a problem with anything, they would fix it, right?
Supposedly, yeah. Got it.
No, they would. If there was something that looked broken, they'd put a new one in. And theoretically, that thing that was broken would then be put into the flight readiness review, where it would be reviewed. It was called an anomaly, and they would go and fix it. And that's where things went wonky, is when they were supposed to go and fix it. But they did notate it and say that. During the very first post-inspection, they thankfully didn't find anything really catastrophically wrong with the ship itself. However, when the ship launched off, they didn't realize how far the launch blast was going to go. So it ended up scorching the earth for over a mile in every direction across the Cape.
God damn.
It wrenched light fixtures off of the walls. It set off fire alarms at the launch gantry. It melted and vaporized cameras. It blew a steel handrail through the wall of an elevator cage. And as the ignition rolled upwards across the Columbia, it buckled fuel lines that were connecting it to the gantry. Thankfully, not the ship itself, but it buckled them. It also knocked off a few of the heat tiles that are very, very important. Thankfully, the location they were knocked off was not unsafe, but like very first mission, we know that heat tiles come off. This is not great. Because it went so well, though, overall, the new NASA administrator, Beggs, pushed for a swift end to all test flights, these manned test flights for the shuttle, so that it could begin carrying out its commercial payload into orbit immediately.
One test. Well, good. Yeah.
Well, they did end up having
everything we need to know.
They did end up having a total of 5. So that 1 plus 4 more.
Oh, that's
a reasonable number. Just wait. The original plan had it going into space more than once a week by the mid-1980s, and they were not on track to have that happen. So the test program was condensed into just a total of 5 flights. And on July 4th, 1982, President Reagan met the Columbia on its final test flight landing and announced that it was cleared for operational flight, a designation usually reserved for aircraft that had flown hundreds of test missions, not 5.
Yeah. And he's definitely qualified to make that determination.
I mean, he's not the one who made the determination. He's the one who made the announcement. But still, while he was giving that, Rah Rocco America speech, giving the designation, the second orbiter roared overhead on the back of a military jet, and it was the Challenger on its way to Cape Canaveral. It had finally been built, and it was on its way to
Columbia, Challenger.
Yep, those are the first 2.
Next to each other.
Yeah, it's fine. It's fine. We're good. After the 5th test flight, when the rockets were recovered from the ocean and that post-inspection happened, technicians noticed a new anomaly. One of the synthetic rubber gaskets sealing sections of the rocket together seemed to have been badly damaged at some point during its 2-minute flight.
It's not concerning at all.
That O-ring that we already have 3 instances. Now we have 4. It was put onto the list, but the damage wasn't bad enough for it to be moved up past just acknowledging that it was damaged when it took off.
Not like it's a key component of keeping the entire thing from exploding.
Completely reasonable, completely fine. Everything's good. Really, to put it bluntly. NASA was no longer recognizable at this point as the agency who had put men on the moon and had recovered so well from the Apollo 1 disaster and had saved the crew on Apollo 13. Between budget cuts, Congress being Congress, and 5 different presidents, and public opinion, all these things had served to create an atmosphere not of innovation, but of scary go fever. Not the go fever of the 1960s, which was bad enough on its own, but the kind of go fever that does not take into account safety pretty much whatsoever.
We need to do this thing or we won't get money.
It was a dangerous time.
Fuck off.
And with that, most of the original volunteers and workers who had worked on Apollo had either retired or left for opportunities that paid better because NASA is no longer really attracting the best and brightest unless they believe strongly in the mission. And even if they believe strongly in the mission, they're being hamstrung. So they just don't have it. The command structure shifts also led to this very shoot the messenger atmosphere when it came to bad news, and personal loyalty was prized above most other things. So, in 1982, J.H. Wiggins completed a risk assessment for space shuttle safety. This was completed on behalf of NASA and at NASA's request. It concluded that the solid rocket boosters pose the highest risk for the entire shuttle system.
Like we've already noted.
At this point, there's also major concerns about the heat tiles. There's major concerns about the engines. I'm focusing on the O-rings for, if you know, you know.
The whole thing it's all fucked up.
It is. It's all fucked up. This study concluded that catastrophic failure was going to happen once out of every 34 to 59 launches, which translated to a loss of crew and spacecraft once every 18 to 30 missions.
What?
Yeah, 18 to 30. Loss of crew and mission. That's what this study that was put out by NASA, that was asked for by NASA, stated. However,
and they still kept going.
Well, they dismissed it.
Of course.
They decided because the joints in the solid rockets had been deemed fail-safe that they were wrong with their assessment and concluded on their own that they could only expect failure once in every 1,000 launches. In fact, odds could probably be improved, and this was a low-end estimate.
We don't ignore science.
They coaxed the other analysts that were loyalists to conclude that failure was only going to happen once out of every 10,000 missions. And that's what they released to the public and to Congress.
Making shit up
After
to serve
those
your
first-
agenda, to serve, yeah. And just,
I'm breaking Arin slowly but surely.
it's so aggravating.
With all of this going on, they also had to decide who was going to be the first woman American in space and who was going to be the first African American in space. They hadn't decided yet. They had hired a number of them. They hadn't picked which one of the 6 women and which one of the African Americans and which one of the minorities were going to be the first. And that's a big deal to be the first.
Okay.
George Abbey and John Young were in charge of deciding who went on what mission, and they ultimately selected Sally Ride as the first woman to be in space and Guy Bluford as the first African-American to be in space.
Okay.
When they released this to the astronaut corps, they did not give any reason for why they had chosen those two, which led to even more of an atmosphere of disappointment and confusion and created quite a bit of a rift in the astronaut corps. They didn't understand why this was happening, and it just created a not great environment where there was a lot more competition than there necessarily needed to be and a lot more distrust between the astronauts than there needed to be, which carried over to middle management, which carried over to the engineers, which carried over to everything.
Go figure. Lack of
worse.
transparency leading to problems.
Yep. In 1983, on April 4th, Challenger took its first maiden voyage, and 2 months later, Sally Ride took it into space, becoming the first woman in space on the Challenger.
Okay.
I'm going to have a little bit of a fun moment here because I think we need it. On Ride's first launch in 1983, NASA infamously asked her how many tampons she was going to need for a week in space. They had gone ahead and packed 100 of them for her. For a week in space.
100 for a week?
These are our greatest minds. They packed her 100 and they asked her,
boys, come on.
They asked her, is this going to be enough?
It's like,
Do you need more? She was like, is this the right number of tampons? And Sally Ride was like, no, that would not be the correct number. Sally Ride was also like a pretty hardcore feminist. She wasn't very girly. She didn't wear a lot of makeup. She didn't do a lot of things. But NASA was trying to figure out like what kind of toiletries they should pack her. They packed all the men's shaving kits and whatnot. So they packed her a makeup kit. And you can look at pictures of it. The makeup kit is just garbage. And I don't wear makeup. And I look at it and go, that's fucking useless. But I find it hilarious.
You gotta do your makeup when you're going up for a week in space. With your 100 tampons.
She said I watched this documentary of her and all the stuff she did. And she was talking about how like there were 6 women in the TFNGs and all of them combined couldn't have used the number of tampons they sent her into space with in over 6 months. And it was like a clown car when she opened it with just tampons floating everywhere because she's pulling out tampons.
Wow.
So yeah, our greatest minds. They made sure she had that covered at least. So, here we are. At Theacol, there was a new manager whose name was Alan McDonald. He was set to be the one who signed off on flight readiness for Theacol. Each section of the NASA, web had to sign off on the flight readiness crew. Alan McDonald was the one who was selected to sign off for the solid rocket boosters for Morton Theacol.
Okay.
He did not love this job. It was a constant source of anxiety for him because his engineers often didn't agree on whether or not something was safe, and he had to make the ultimate call with the budgetary restrictions in mind and the fact that NASA was actively looking for other contractors to replace Morton Theacol, either because of budgetary constraints and also because, I didn't super mention it, but Morton Theacol had an explosion a couple of months earlier at one of their plants when there was a mistake made when they were reloading the solid rocket boosters.
Oh.
They blew up the whole plant.
So they just had one of these rocket boosters blow up on the ground.
They did. I mean, that was their mistake. It wasn't anything wrong with the rocket booster. They fucked up. But NASA was like,
But is that volatile?
Maybe we don't use them. So Theokol was very concerned about losing their contract with NASA, which was $1 billion contract. It was a lot of money. And it all kind of landed on him. If he sided with the engineers who said it wasn't safe, he was going to get in trouble with his bosses, or could potentially, but also people could die. And, it's just a tough spot for him. He was startled when he heard about the problems with the O-rings because he hadn't been informed of it over multiple missions. It wasn't until late in 1983 that he found out that this was even remotely an issue, much less that it had remained unsolved for years dating back to the late 1970s. He was not the only one in the NASA hierarchy who had never heard of these faults. Administrator Beggs, as I've said before, who was well known for his micromanaging and attention to detail, had no idea that the O-rings could potentially be a problem. There was a long list of other problems that concerned him: disintegrating rocket nozzles, contact issues, pressure to meet the planned launch schedule. There had been a few other missions where the O-rings had shown some charring, along with that we talked briefly about the little air pockets that would show in
the putty.
They had assumed that those air pockets were causing the charring, so they started freezing the putty, and that hadn't really solved the issue. There were still things going on. Sally Ride's first mission had an issue. Guy Bluford's first mission had an issue. And they hadn't been resolved, and they hadn't been moved up the chain of command at all, which is just this is happening over and over and over again, which is just super, super awesome. The disintegrating rocket nozzles comes from Guy Bluford's first flight.
Okay.
When he went up on the Challenger, the nozzles on the rocket started to disintegrate, and it was found in the post-flight inspection that if the engine had continued going for more than another minute or so, it would have completely disintegrated and exploded, killing everyone on board.
Oh, wow.
So not only do they not fully understand what's going on with these problems, they're getting worse. They're getting worse every time they discover one. And that doesn't mean it's happening on every single flight. It's not, because these flights are happening over and over. I'm only touching on a few. But they were getting worse when they did happen. And most people didn't know. I wouldn't even say most people. Most people in higher positions didn't know what was going on. Because the people that knew were the low guys and the middle managers. Yep. But Al McDonald, we're going to love him. Don't worry. He was pretty appalled to find out what was going on and having a really difficult time figuring out how to manage his position and do the right thing.
Okay. I can sympathize with that.
On June 26, 1984, Discovery was set to launch. Unfortunately, there was a fire on the launch pad that had to scrub the mission 3 seconds before it was set to go off, right before the rockets ignited. Now, fire on the launch pad. For those of you who don't know, hydrogen burns completely colorless and completely odorless. So you can't see hydrogen fires as a rule.
Oh.
Do you want to know how NASA tests and figures out where those kinds of fires are?
How?
It's called broom test.
They send janitors out?
I mean, they're not janitors.
They just hold brooms out and see if they catch on fire?
They're men waving brooms, and when they catch on fire, that's where the leak is.
Oh my God.
So there was a fire on the launch pad.
With all this high-tech shit.
The broom test!
We have things that can see heat.
We land people on the moon.
We have cameras that can see heat. You're just going to go wave a broom around until it...
in the 1970s? I mean, not that it matters, because they still do that today, the broom test, in 2025.
I mean, it is a lot cheaper.
It is a lot cheaper. But there's a fire on the launch pad. They decided not to evacuate the crew, not because of this colorless and odorless fire, but because the escape baskets hadn't been tested with human beings inside of them yet. And they weren't sure.
How many missions are we into this and they haven't tested this?
I don't remember, but we are a number of missions into this and they hadn't tested it yet. It turned out
morons.
that the engine had shut down from a faulty valve, and the fire had been caused by that hydrogen propellant escaping the nozzle. And where the fire was, if the astronauts had left the cockpit, they would have been incinerated by this invisible fire. So it's a good thing they didn't let them out.
At least they didn't.
But that's the thing. Judy Resnick said, "I was disappointed, but I was relieved that the safety systems do work. It was unfortunate we had to figure that out, but it built confidence in the whole system." Poor Judy.
It doesn't build confidence in the system. It shows more
confident.
Problems.
She didn't know, though.
I mean,
she didn't know.
That's also alarming.
Yeah. The Discovery didn't end up launching until August 30th, 1984, between changes and other scrubbed launches. Remember how long they waited to test shit with Apollo missions? How much they did it?
Yeah, it was a long-ass time. Months.
Yeah, they're still launching, though, with all of these issues, still figuring these things out. So, yeah. This is the mission where Guy Bluford became the first African-American in space on STS-8. We talked about this a little bit already, but this was his flight. This was the first flight that was launched at night. And this is the one where the rockets, when they were recovered, it was discovered that the lining of the nozzles had been eaten away. And calculations showed that if the fuel had burned for just 8 or 9 seconds longer, the spacecraft would have been completely destroyed. So engineers at Theacal were tasked with figuring out why and solving that issue on top of other things. After Discovery's launch, it was also discovered that there was no soot in the second O-ring. Not just the first, in the second. Because the first O-ring had been destroyed. It was clear to anyone with half a brain that engineers and managers' confidence was completely misplaced, and this is bad. This is getting worse.
Yeah.
McDonald collected a crew to analyze what went wrong and prepare a report, but there was only 1 week between that launch and the next launch to figure out if he could or should recommend going forward with the next mission.
Why?
On September 12th, McDonald presented the results of this report to NASA and reconfirmed rationale from earlier that the damage wasn't bad, it was within safety margins, it was limiting. The new phenomena was now called a blow-by and considered unprecedented. Fine. The escape of hot gas had only lasted less than a second before the seal had done its job, the joint fully pressurized, and there hadn't been time for the gas jet to cause full damage to the second O-ring. Just because it had soot in there doesn't mean it's a problem, so it still feels safe.
Basically, we got lucky, so there's no problem.
Basically.
We just keep getting lucky.
Yep.
So
during the final review cataloging, so before it gets to Beg's desk, the O-ring anomaly was classified as an acceptable risk with no need of discussion.
Oh, don't talk about it.
Yep.
Shut your mouths. Do your jobs. Don't talk about it.
So we're at a critical inflection point here. Acceptable risk had been completely expanded over the years, particularly for the joints, but really for multiple parts of the spaceship. They had incrementally accepted as normal problems that really, really, really weren't normal. Mission after mission hadn't been catastrophic. No one had died, so it's fine. It's fine.
It's the lobster in the pot as the
absolutely the lobster in the pot
slowly turned up, and it doesn't notice that it's boiling alive.
It's 100%. Rationalization beat out good science. 100%. The O-rings were not safe. They were known to fail. They were known. It had happened on multiple missions. They knew about it before. This is where it is.
Any sort of pattern recognition, you can see right away that this is going to be a catastrophic problem. It's just a matter of time.
Yes, sir. The current plan for NASA missions was to now have at least one mission a month through the course of 1985. This is still a long way away from the more than one a week by 1985, but still it was a significant step up. With only 35 astronauts, despite the competition and eagerness to get in space, there was concern that there wouldn't be enough to train and enough to go up in and do all these different missions. So more astronauts were found, and they planned on hiring more and more every single year. With that, they also were trying to get more good publicity. Something called the Citizens in Space Task Force was founded in 1983. I'm going to talk about it. I'm going to tell you what it is. You guys can't see Aaron's face. The whole idea of this was flying private citizens into space to get good publicity for NASA from the...
Oh, rich people. Got it.
So not necessarily rich people. It's literally a publicity stunt by NASA.
Okay.
In the report, it said, quote, flight of private citizens is both feasible and desirable. Public may see the project as a self-serving public relations gimmick that incentivizes the space program, but it's worthwhile.
We've got this ship that's just a rattling bag of bolts about to explode. Let's take the public up in it now.
But what they were telling the public was, this is just as safe as a commercial airline. We're basically making space like flying to Las Vegas. It's no big deal. So they were
trying to do that for years.
They were actively looking for regular Joes to go up in space and do cool space things to keep the space program in people's imagination to make them excited about it. They considered the best candidates for the first Joe Schmo to go into space to be teachers or journalists.
Mm-hmm.
Because again,
they'll
that's
spread
a
the
good
word.
thing. Dan Rather, in particular, was real excited. He really, really wanted to go. But President Reagan ultimately made the call that it should be a teacher.
Okay.
That the first citizen in space, the first regular Joe in space, should be a teacher. Because the biggest audience they have in the country who can get excited about space are children. And sending a teacher up into space would get kids excited about it, which would get their parents excited about it. And it would give you an introduction to people that you wouldn't get any other way. And would give you good publicity. This is 1983 that the report was put out and that Reagan decided it should be a teacher. And it really rolled out in 1985.
Because I remember, I was born in 83.
I know.
I remember the, hey, you could be an astronaut. And the posters with all the rockets on them. And
do you remember the Challenger breaking up? You were old enough.
I don't remember it like...
No, you weren't. You were 3. I lied.
Yeah, I don't remember it like I remember 9/11 happening.
Well, yeah.
You know, I was aware that it happened. I don't remember. I don't remember the event happening.
Well, they decided to
time.
send up a teacher. This is what they wanted to do. So they were actively looking for the teacher that they were going to send up in space. Reagan, when he made the decision on it, said, "Today I'm directing NASA to begin a search in all of our elementary and secondary schools and to choose as the first citizen passenger in the history of our space program, one of America's finest, a teacher. When that shuttle lifts off, all of America will be reminded of the crucial role that teachers and education play in our life and that of our nation. I can't think of a better lesson for our children or our country." The Citizens in Space program became Teacher in Space program. And NASA went off on its search to find a teacher to take up to space. Not everyone was happy about it. Teachers' unions, in particular, were pretty pissy.
Really?
Yeah, they put out saying, quote, "We don't need to send one teacher into space. We need to send all teachers into their classrooms fully equipped and ready to help the students learn. Sending a teacher into outer space won't solve the problems on schools here on Earth."
Put your money where it should.
They're not wrong. But they weren't the only ones. John Glenn and many other astronauts also pretty deeply opposed this program because they knew this wasn't safe. That even though it was being pushed to the public as basically just a giant airplane, they knew it wasn't that safe. They didn't know how unsafe it was, but they knew this was new technology.
Yeah.
And they were like, this is not fair to put someone on this plane who doesn't have the training to understand exactly what they're getting themselves into.
Yeah, absolutely.
So for the public, this was a very popular program, but within NASA and then other, subsects of the population, it was not necessarily the most popular program, but it continued forward.
Of course.
In 1985, Krista McGolf, a high school teacher from Concord, New Hampshire, was selected by NASA to be the first average citizen in space for NASA's space flight participation program. She was adorable. Extremely excited, extremely charming, literally the perfect person you could pick to explain NASA to the public and to children and to bring good press to that program. I love her so much. She was so excited about the opportunity, but didn't really feel like she deserved it necessarily. She didn't even submit or start work on her application until 10 days before it was due because she was so nervous about the essay she had to write about it. And she didn't drop it off until literally the last possible minute on February 1st, 1985.
Wow.
And she was just like, she was so nervous about it and she just wanted to do a good job that it took her that long to work up the courage to do it. The teacher in flight mission was going to be STS-51L, and it was going to be the 25th launch in 1986. It was going to have an experienced crew made up of Commander Dick Scooby, Mission Specialist Judy Resnick, Ron McNair, Ellison Onzuka, and pilot Mike Smith, who was the only one of the NASA crew who hadn't crossed the Kármán line yet, hadn't officially been into space yet, and then Gregory Jarvis. And we're going to go through all of those names more as we get here.
I'm going back and remembering the report saying one in 18 to 25 missions.
18 to 30.
18 to 30 missions will fail.
I mean, I think you can guess where this is going.
Oh, yeah.
But we're not going to get to that in this episode. We're gonna go through a few more things, and then we're going to wrap it up. During the selection process for the teachers were informed that there were issues with the agency, that this was largely about publicity, and that they needed to be a spokesperson. They needed to represent NASA in a good way. And they would be required to tour the country, essentially, and say all nice things about NASA for at least a year after they went up into space. So to an extent, they kind of knew what they were getting into. I mean, I'm glad they told them that, at least, you know?
I mean, does not actually highlight the risk.
The actual issues.
Yeah.
Which is you might die.
And it's, regardless of what you see, you need to say good things about us.
Yeah, no matter what, say good things. The ambitious shuttle flight program continued to have problems throughout the course of 1985, but continued to do it anyway. On the 15th flight, it was pushed back because of a cold weather snap in Florida that caused ice on the launch pad, which could damage the heat shields. Challenger's flight in February was delayed again because they had to replace 4,000 tiles that had been sheared off in a previous mission. And then they had a senator, Senator Garn, who started threatening the agency's funding if he didn't get a spot on one of the shuttle missions up into space. Yep, this happens more than once. Poor Mike
You've
Smith
got to be fucking...
was supposed to go on that flight, and he was bumped so that Senator Garn could go on it. He said that he was only going on as an observer to understand where taxpayer money was going.
Bullshit.
He was lambasted in the press. Like, it was obvious what this man was doing.
He just wanted to go to space.
But he did it anyway. NASA insisted they didn't bump Smith from the project because of political pressure, but, like, they bumped him from it because of political pressure.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, not Smith, Jarvis. Greg Jarvis is the one who got bumped from that. And they said it wasn't because of political pressure, but it was. Garn was not entirely off base in his whole analysis, though, wanting to see where taxpayer money was going. The promise NASA had made in 1972 of having at least one, preferably more than one, mission launching a week was set to be going by 1985, and clearly it wasn't. NASA's bill was coming due, and they did not have the ability to actually fulfill it. So they were on incredibly thin ice with the entire government, including the Reagan administration, which outwardly was very supportive of the space program, but inside the White House itself was kind of like, what the hell are we doing with this? Many people inside of the White House wanted to kind of pivot to more of a military aspect, and they didn't totally understand this teacher in space program. They didn't really like that there was a lot of science and exploration in this. They wanted it to either make money or be fully militarized. The true accounting of the space shuttle program was coming to light. When NASA had given its initial calculations in 1972, they had said that each payload would end up costing around $270 per pound. But instead, what it came out to with how few launches they were doing was $5,200 per pound that went up into space.
That is a big difference.
Almost 20 times more than what they had initially sent. And the only way to bring down that cost was to ramp up the number of missions.
Yeah, this is going to turn out well.
So Beggs had folks at the Cape working around the clock to rotate the three shuttles, Columbia, Challenger, and Discovery more frequently, and to prepare that fourth orbiter, Atlantis, for its very first maiden voyage in May of 1985. It announced that instead of doing one mission a month, it was going to do 2 missions a month in the next year. And the reality was that no matter how many missions they promised, no matter how much they thought this could work, a complex machine cannot be safely flown into our orbit like a jumbo jet on a shoestring budget. This was not possible. Crews at the Cape had to put in 3 years of work for every single minute that an orbiter spent in space.
Jesus.
And with very little money, they weren't paying people very much. Disassembly of the ships after each mission were showing things like the brakes and steering weren't holding up as expected to repeated use and needed to be replaced. The tires were at risk of explosion. The hand-built components of the main engines were less robust than expected, and the tiles were forever a huge worry.
Oh my God.
When Discovery returned in April of 1985, it was discovered that part of the heat shield on the left wing had come off during liftoff and during re-entry melted through a control flap, resulting in a hole over a foot wide through the entire wing.
Well, they were fucking lucky.
Yeah, very lucky, over and over and over again. The cost cutting also meant that they were chronically short of spare parts, so engineers often had to cannibalize components from orbiters that had just returned from space to use on the next one going out. Steal from Peter to pay Paul.
Oh my God.
As the timing stepped up,
that's
crews
not
started
good for the
working.
machine either.
No, not at all. As the timing stepped up, the crews had to start working round-the-clock shifts, and instead of having one duty to focus on, they'd have 2, 3, 4 at a time.
Mm-hmm.
Beggs asked Lockheed, one of their contractors, to take control of the complex flow of tasks that it took to prepare orbiters for launch, which meant that quality control inspectors and safety checks fell, and overtime hours and overtired workers increased. Senior managers and engineers were often working 12-hour days, 7 days a week for months at a time.
Oh.
With no break in between.
That's disgusting.
Mistakes were inevitable, but the 3 shuttles kept launching over and over and over again. In April 1985, Discovery and Challenger launched within 17 days of each other, and they were somehow still losing. They were not launching enough. They were still behind their projected promises, and the increase in intensity of the launch schedule made the public's interest fall because it was happening so often. It was so routine. They just weren't that into it. Most journalists considered Cape duty as death watch. They were just there in case something happened. That's all they were doing.
So they were down there praying for something to blow up.
Yep, pretty much. I'm going to backtrack a little bit to January 1985 because I wanted to spend the most time on this one. Just know that throughout the course of 1985, from this one on, there was repeated issues, but this one's really important. On January 21st, 1985, thousands of Florida trees were dying in the freezing cold weather for an unprecedented cold snap. The weather was significantly colder than basically ever in Florida. It was so cold that the governor had declared a state of emergency in Florida due to the cold weather. Over 126 people died when temperatures plunged.
Holy crap.
Discovery was supposed to launch that day. In D.C., temperatures were at -7, and the planned outdoor ceremony to inaugurate 73-year-old Ronald Reagan for the second time was canceled because they were afraid the marching band's fingers would get frostbite.
Wow.
At Cape Canaveral, the water in the plumbing system of Pad 39 froze solid and burst the pipes.
Ooh.
NASA staff worried that ice on the gantry and Discovery's external tank may break off during the planned launch and be deadly, knocking off heat tiles or causing damage in some other way. The liftoff was delayed for 24 hours to wait for it to melt and make repairs. It wasn't launched until January 24th, once the temperature had risen to the low 60s, and some of the coldest weather that the shuttle had ever encountered or launched in. In January of 1985, the man in charge of the majority of the post-flight inspections was someone named Roger Bojali. He was a really interesting dude. Before he started work as a NASA engineer, he worked as an airline engineer, and he was one of the folks who helped design an airplane called the McDonnell Douglas DC-10.
Okay. Yeah.
He was part of the team that was in charge of the cargo bay doors on this airplane. From the beginning of the design of this airplane, he and others who were designing it had concerns about flaws in the design of the safety locking mechanism, which they suspected was going to be able to open in mid-flight. He pushed for a redesign, then pushed for to just stop the certification, but he ultimately failed. On March 3rd, 1974, Turkish Airlines Flight 981's cargo bay door burst open 9 minutes after takeoff.
Oh, fun.
6 passengers were sucked out the back.
They were using a cargo plane for passengers?
It's cargo bay doors on an airliner. So it's not a cargo plane, but even regular airliners have doors that go down to put cargo in. So the cargo bay doors popped open. 6 passengers died, and then the entire passenger compartment collapsed, and the plane crashed into a wooded valley at 500 miles per hour, 77 seconds after that, killing 346 passengers and crew.
God damn.
He was absolutely haunted by this. He felt like he hadn't done enough to stop it when he knew that there was a problem, and this plays large in his role in this disaster and things that happened. He started working for Morton Thiokol in 1980, and he found out quickly that his zeal for improvement fueled by this disaster was not particularly welcome in the atmosphere at NASA. He also found that much of their tech was outdated, and most of his ideas for increasing safety and cutting costs were completely poo-pooed by his boss, Bob Lund. Bob Lund would always initially act interested, but somehow, some way, things always stayed the status quo. Bob Lund was eventually promoted to the vice president of engineering, seemingly because he was always obedient and compliant to the wishes of upper management, and his convictions were very malleable, according to Bojali. He was very much. Bojali had been a direct witness to the O-ring failures from the very, very start, and he was confident in the conclusions that had been made that this was all within the safety margins. The backup was there if it first failed, but he was consistently working on a solution, and he knew that there was no way that NASA would ground flights unless the O-ring problem got worse and worse and worse. But he was working on it. He knew. So in January 1985, he was already an old hand at studying this particular seal and doing these post-flight inspections. After this January 1985 discovery flight, when he examined the forward joint, he was filled with absolute horror when he saw that the secondary O-ring was not just jet black with a little bit of soot. Much of the rubber had been vaporized.
Oh, shit.
Most of that secondary O-ring was gone. It was an extreme escalation of the persistent problem.
Yeah.
The black path stretched a full 1/3 of the way around the second ring and had obliterated the first O-ring. They had lost their race with the hot gas, and they had failed to seal. The joints in the second rocket, however, were even worse. A black trail extended a full 7 feet. The hot gas had incinerated the primary seal and had caused some of the worst damage he had ever seen in the joints. He was astonished that Discovery hadn't blown apart on the launch pad before it got up into the air.
Wow.
His mind immediately went to the cold. If anyone has played with rubber, you know that when rubber gets cold, it gets less malleable.
Yeah, more brittle.
And this is the coldest a shuttle had ever launched in, at 53 degrees.
Right. They were recommended to test in a variety of temperatures.
This is why I was really emphatic when I said at the expected temperatures of the Cape.
Uh-huh.
And 53 degrees would not be an expected temperature.
Mm-hmm.
Nonetheless, it was there, this happened, and it caused some of the worst damage he had ever personally seen.
Yeah.
He presented his findings to a group of 30 to 40 engineers and to senior NASA managers. He was hesitant to share his full conclusions because he knew that it would endanger this hectic schedule that we just talked about and jeopardize the future of the program and his job, but he still did it. He told them about it. He told them that he thought the rockets had merely been crippled by the cold. He said, quote, "Guys, you probably don't want to hear this, but I'm going to tell you anyway. It's my technical opinion that the precipitating cause of this event was temperature." Only a single voice in this meeting responded, and they said, "You're right, Raj. We don't want to hear it."
You're gotta be fucking shitting me.
Nope. This prompted an absolutely frantic search by Bojali to find a scientific explanation and a fix before the next flight readiness review. The pressure was high. The next launch was only a few weeks away. They couldn't find anything. It all seemed no different than the other flights, which left only the temperature. The temperature on the pad may have been 62 degrees, but inside the solid rockets, it was far lower. The dense propellant was below freezing for 3 days before the final countdown began, and it retained much of the cold temperature even as the weather warmed, which chilled the O-rings. When the motors lit, the temperature was only 53 degrees in that part of the rocket.
Mm-hmm.
Bojali and many of his colleagues believed that the record low temperatures at the Cape had caused that synthetic rubber to shrink and harden in the cold, like you said, to become more brittle, reducing its squeeze. But he lacked specific data to support this. Reason stood with basic physics, but he couldn't prove that the cold had caused the leaks because no one had ever tested the seals against a range of temperatures. In NASA culture at this time, his conclusion was basically nothing more than a hunch and not worthy of full consideration. He was reprimanded for using words like "I think" and "I feel" in his flight readiness briefings.
Oh, yeah.
He was told he had to use enhanced probability or have full backing of his conclusions. And anyway, don't worry about it.
I've been there.
I know you have. He was also told not to worry about it because it doesn't get cold that much. This was a once-in-a-lifetime circumstance. Mm-hmm. It's never going to happen again.
Mm-hmm.
When he suggested that restrictions be placed on launches in cold weather, he was completely rebuffed because, like I said, when else is it going to be that cold in Florida? There were experiments ordered to test the O-rings in cold temperatures, but they were considered low priority, and the joints were waved through onto the next mission in April 1985. As the flight readiness went up the chain, more and more got knocked off or fixed by the time it reached people like Administrator Beggs. And by February 1985, less than a month after this happened, there was no mention of temperature or O-rings at all on the flight readiness checklist.
Yeah, I can't say that I've seen that in successive military reports at all.
I'm sure you've never encountered anything like this whatsoever. He did the best he could with the funding that he had to test them. And he was able to show that cold temperatures made the rings inflexible, that might fail to seal against metal surfaces, not just for a moment, but at any point in the dangerous 2-minute flight, but they were not completely conclusive. When he reported his findings to his manager, he was told to keep the data to himself, that it would be too damaging to the company if anyone at NASA learned what he'd found out. And they said they'd continue to evaluate and address the problem, but the resiliency tests that he had performed remained a secret, known only to Bose-Joly and his colleague Arnie Thomas and a handful of other techs. Things continued at that frenetic pace that we talked about. They were still going. They were launching over and over. In April 1985, they found even worse seal damage, charring the primary and secondary seals. This time, the secondary seal wasn't just charred, but most of it had been eaten away by the gas plume, along with other problems going on. For the April 1985 launch, where it ate most of both seals, unlike other problems where it had sealed after a few seconds, the gasket in the left booster didn't seal at all. It burned all the way through. Analysis showed that the seal had failed on launch pad and leaked continuously for the entire 122 seconds. It was yet another escape. If it had continued burning for 0.3 more of a second, it would have ignited an explosion that would have killed everyone on board. This also did not make it into the flight readiness.
Of course it didn't. What the actual fuck?
This April launch caused panic in the Morton Thiokol camp. The next launch was less than 3 weeks away. They needed to be able to launch that next one. And in order to avoid delaying that liftoff, Al McDonald assembled an emergency anomaly team to investigate these O-rings. When NASA found out, they insisted that Thiokol fly to Alabama within the week to present them with a full review of the history of the O-ring failures since the beginning of the program, to decide whether or not to ground the entire shuttle fleet while the problem was fixed.
I mean, that sounds like finally something.
It sounds great.
Of course it's not going to be, is it?
It's never great.
The smile she just gave me, it's not okay. I'm going to drink more.
The rocket engineers that Thiokol sent to that initial meeting didn't have much information about what had gone wrong, so Thiokol was told to come back to NASA headquarters the following month to give a comprehensive presentation on the solid rockets and the joint failures, along with their efforts to fix them. In the meantime, the anomaly team that McDonald had put together was still working on using computer modeling and lab testing to understand that latest O-ring damage. It wasn't until July that they flew to Alabama to give said presentation. After that April launch, and they're still launching missions in between those. And for the very first time, Thiokol revealed the results of the temperature testing on the O-rings. It was science, but he didn't have enough funding to be able to do full testing, so it was inconclusive science, but it was the first time that they had presented those findings that they had told Bose-Joly to hide. Thiokol also used computer projections to show that even in the worst-case scenario of secondary seal erosion, the backup O-ring would never become so damaged that it failed completely, that the joint was no longer safe.
Except it already had, right?
Well, was it unsafe? Because everyone lived. Their point was...
By, 0.3 of a second?
But their point was everyone lived, so it did what it was supposed to do. No one died, so it's fine. NASA instructed them to come up with a NASA instructed them to come up with a redesign, but they were satisfied that they didn't need to ground the fleet. Since they were already working on a redesign, it wasn't necessarily necessary to even discuss the O-ring erosion at the flight readiness reviews for future missions. And within 2 days of that meeting, another shuttle crew received clearance to fly. Bose-Joly jumped at the chance to redesign. He came up with more than 30 different sketches over the course of 72 hours, which he printed and dispersed to colleagues. He was greeted with silence by management. He was given absolutely no funding, and nothing really came of it. It was considered low priority. That mission that launched 2 days after in July 1985, there was a problem with the main temperature sensor in the engine. It failed, and then the second one failed a little over 3 minutes after launch. When those temperature sensors fail, it's either because it got too hot or because there's a problem with the sensor, and it shuts down the engine.
Okay. This is the main
engines, not the rocket boosters.
Yeah.
The rocket boosters can't be shut off.
Right.
When those two engines went off, they had to make a call. There was a chance that it was the temperature sensors that had just kind of failed. Or it could be that there was a problem. The bigger issue was in order to abort that mission, do you remember when I talked about the abort missions they had were essentially a hope and a prayer?
Yeah.
And they were going to try and, it was something to do before they died.
Yes.
This was going to be one of those circumstances. If they tried to abort the mission and get home, they weren't going to be able to make it to orbit. They were going to have to abort. If they tried to use those procedures, odds are they were going to die. So they had the choice between doing the abort or trying to turn the engines back on and overriding the temperature sensors.
Oh my God.
You can guess what they chose.
They chose push ahead, restart the engines.
And it worked. And they were able to land, I think it was Discovery on this one. I think it was Discovery. I don't remember. It was one of the shuttles. They restarted them and they were able to land it and everyone survived. This was something that scared the crap out of NASA because they had been more concerned about the engines for a long, long time as being a main source of problems. But because it wasn't actually engines, it was the temperature sensors. Let it go. It's
course.
Fine. We're good.
Couldn't be the engines. It was the sensors.
While NASA's dealing with all of that, Bose Jolly was struggling mightily with the responsibility and the lack of action going on. He was still absolutely haunted by Flight 981. In July of 1985, he completely reached his limit with the lack of funding and all these other things going on, and he sent a memo addressed to Bob Lund and copied it to multiple other senior engineering managers at the plant.
Oh, good.
It said, quote, "This letter is written to ensure that management is fully aware of the seriousness of the current O-ring erosion problem," and went on to explain why it was a mistake to think that NASA could safely continue flying. Given the damage he'd seen in April and in January, he could not rule out a total failure of joint and in all probability within the first second after ignition. The result would be a catastrophe of the highest order, loss of human life. He stopped just short of urging immediate action to halt all flights, but he did call for a dedicated team of engineers to work full-time on the O-ring problem and to be given authority and funding to be able to carry out that work as quickly as possible. Quote, "It is my honest and very real fear that if we do not take immediate action, we stand in jeopardy of losing a flight along with all launch pad facilities," end quote. That memo eventually made its way to Al McDonald's desk, who decided to finally include it in his flight readiness review that was due at NASA on August 19th. When he told Larry Malloy at the Marshall Space Flight, who was his boss, Malloy was furious that he hadn't been consulted about the meeting itself, the first one, or I guess the second one that had happened before that memo went down in July. And he told McDonald that he couldn't deliver the briefing unless its contents were approved by him. So McDonald put it in the briefing. The briefing went to his boss, and his boss was like, "You can't do this. It isn't approved by me." So McDonald went ahead and faxed a copy down 4 days before the next conference, and Malloy called him to add some amendments to that. McDonald wanted to say, "This isn't safe. We need to ground things and fix it." Malloy wanted to add a clause indicating that Thiokol recommended that it would continue to be safe to fly as long as inspectors and checks were performed, and 2, remove the statement that data obtained on resilience of O-rings indicate that lower temperatures aggravate this problem. On August 19th, 1985, Alan McDonald gave his presentation to a team of NASA's most senior managers.
Hiding in my hood.
This was the first time he'd ever given a briefing at NASA headquarters. More than a dozen NASA officials in the room, led by NASA Deputy Associate Administrator Mike Weeks, who had first raised alarm in Washington about the seals, had been summoned by McDonald. McDonald's corporate bosses from Thiokol and Larry Malloy were also there, along with managers of the Solid Rocket Program and the Marshall Space Flight Center, just tons and tons of people. Jesse Moore, who was the head of the review portion of the shuttle program, was supposed to be there. He reported directly to Chief Beggs, but the plan changed when Challenger had that close call and Moore's attention had been focused on investigating that problem with the engines instead of on this. The briefing lasted a total of 3 hours and included more than 50 charts. It was the most candid report on the solid rockets that Thiokol had ever presented to NASA. McDonald explained the primary seal was more prone to erosion, but the secondary O-ring would always seal. McDonald also told,
It's fried.
Right? McDonald also told them that there had been disagreement about the issue, and while he believes that, not everyone believes that, and his recommendation was to find a solution for the problem as soon as possible to prevent the opening at launch and to step up the pace to stop the seal erosion. He told the room, though, that it was safe to continue flying while they worked the problem, despite the engineers' concerns, and the room took him at his word. Mike Weeks was not super thrilled about this. He didn't feel satisfied, so he went to George Hardy, who had been there since the Apollo program, and George Hardy brushed him off. He wasn't concerned about it, so they continued on. launched the 20th space shuttle mission 7 days later. Robert Bojali's loss of life letter had finally goaded some action. One of the things that came from that meeting McDonald put together, though, was they created a SEAL task force, essentially, that was dedicated entirely to figuring out the O-ring problems and funding those O-rings problems. Theoretically. On August 20th, Bob Lund circulated a memo giving them even more official status, and he ended up appointing Bojali and 4 other engineers to work full-time on the problem. At first, they were optimistic, but they were soon very disappointed. They found it almost impossible to get things done. The plant was not set up for research and development, so they didn't have many of the tools they needed to do the testing they needed to do. And everyone around them was already working feverishly to manufacture the booster rockets that were necessary to maintain the breakneck speed of the space shuttle schedule. They couldn't buy new pieces of equipment and testing because while they did have funding, they didn't have a lot of funding and they didn't have a research facility. Long story short, the SEAL task force existed, but it was functionally useless. There was not a lot they could do. There was not a lot they could do.
Backing or power or facilities. They were hamstrung completely.
Exactly. By October, Bojali was just so fucking done with all of this. He sent out a 2-page report.
I'm fucking done with all this.
To Al McDonald. Part of it read, "Help. The SEAL task force is constantly being delayed by every possible means. We wish we could get action. This is a red flag." It made no difference whatsoever, and another 3 shuttle launches went off with no changes or progress forward. Robert Bojali was filled with fear. The weather was getting colder and colder. It was looking to be a historically cold winter at the Cape.
Yay!
He started calling out sick rather than deal with the chaos. At one point, he ended up running out of his office with his arms flailing over his head, shouting that the company should halt all rocket production immediately before astronauts were killed, shouting, "We need to shut the back gate and stop sending this shit out of here." His colleagues barely noticed and internally just kind of poo-pooed him.
Wow.
And that is where we're going to leave off.
Wow. He's literally running through the space screaming, "Stop!
Stop killing people.
You're going to kill people."
Oh.
And they're like, no, they don't know what he's talking about.
So that
it's just him. He's
pretty much,
he's Debbie Downer.
He's such a bummer. Poor Roger.
Yeah, he's always saying that stuff. Don't pay any attention to him. Fuck off.
So this is 2 hours.
Oh my God. It's an absolute shit show.
And I really debate. I probably could have condensed this a lot more, but it's just so mind-bogglingly awful how long this was an issue. And we heard so much about the heat tiles, and thankfully the engines never resulted in a loss of crew. But that's just pure luck that the engines didn't end up killing someone. Like, if they had continued the shuttle program without changing the engines, they would have eventually. Absolutely. And next week, we are going to start off right around January 1986. And that one is going to be basically the entire disaster, what happened to the crew, and the Rogers Commission, the after effects of what happened with the Challenger disaster. But I wanted to split it into 2 because I didn't want to, I feel like this disaster deserves the full background. You deserve to know exactly how much people knew.
And all the shit that was swept under the rug.
Over and over and over and over again. I mean, at 2 hours, 10 years.
Fucking isolated to this incident.
Oh, no, not at all. Not even a little bit. And this is a recurrent problem, and this is something that happens, like Arin keeps saying, with the military, but really in multiple.
In corporations, in so much.
We make jokes a lot about follow the money, but it's true. Money corrupts. And I'm not saying they should have just thrown
profits above all
money.
Else.
But man.
My whole thing is when you have something that's clearly not working, stop throwing fucking money at it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Be willing to walk the sunk fallacy.
I mean, we started almost at the
fallacy.
beginning. That's what the New York Times was saying. Like, maybe we should just call this.
And I feel that so deep in my core, like, there's a point where you just need to go, okay, we've spent enough fucking money on this. Stop.
100%. Though I will say I love NASA and I love the work that they've done. So I understand where you're coming from here, but there's got to have been a way. There has to be a way to push the limits of technology safely. We did it with the Apollo program. And I think, for me personally, I would love to see more funding make its way.
That was because profits weren't prioritized in that. Now, I'm sure, people were making money off of that. Companies were making money off of that. But that wasn't the goal of the program.
Yeah.
It wasn't for the funding.
Yeah.
They needed funding in order to do this amazing work.
100%.
But they had lofty ideals and noble goals, right?
True.
And then that got lost.
I think we should probably continue this conversation off the podcast a little bit. If you guys have opinions and thoughts, shoot us messages, because this is a lot and you're going to have to wait a week to find out how it all went bad. I think it was worth it. I'm glad we did it this way. It was a lot of work to get all this together, but I think this is the best way to do it. But we've been in your ears for a long time now. So get in touch with us on social media. We're everywhere. Our email is catastrophichroniclespod@gmail.com. Our website is www.catastrophe-chronicles.com, and the website is where we have the show notes. If you want the books that I read so many books, and they're all kind of tied into all these different episodes, so I almost feel like my sources are just going to be repeats each week at this point.
Yeah.
But, there's lots of cool information there. We have a tip jar if you want to financially support the podcast. Do not feel obligated, but it's there if you choose to use it. We would really, really love to hear from you. Please let me know if you want me to do that Russian thingamabobber. Those Russian disasters. Yep. Yeah. And with that,
stay safe, everyone.
And stay curious.